Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 656. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here, and always happy you're listening. With Trump, we've been having the flip-flop. You know, we've got a deal, we don't have a deal. We got a deal, but the Iranians didn't sign it. We're going to have a deal. It's going to be the greatest deal ever. It's the same thing over and over again. And it's a little bit confusing. So we're not going to get into that until we have a deal. Just for the record, I don't think the deal is going to be very good. It's going to be a loss for America. We're going to end up giving some sort of security guarantees, probably. We're going to end up agreeing to let them control the Strait of Hormuz. We're probably going to end up agreeing to leave the Middle East. Potentially, it's going to be a bad look for Donald Trump. Now, having said all that, I'm okay with all that. I got no problem with that. So we'll see what happens. No use in really speculating. Today, I want to talk about what might this look like? And more importantly, you know, why are we having all this change right now? What is causing this? And when I want to look at history and see where this has happened, maybe not exactly the same way, but it's happened in a similar way. Now, if some of you might be familiar with Ray Dalio, wrote this book, and I can't remember the name of the book, but he talks about great powers, great rivals, taking on existing powers, and he talks about these conditions for major change in the world. And he's making the case that we're essentially coming up to one of these inflection points where you have major changes in the world. And one of the conditions for these changes he talks about is when a hegemon is challenged by a rival power. And so today we have this guy, Richard Werner. Richard Werner, you know, he wrote a book called Princes of Yin, which is a very famous book. That's not what he's going to talk about today. But I just thought this was one of the most interesting conversations that I've heard in a while. I know I keep saying that, but I keep finding these really interesting conversations that are taking place today, right now, in the current time. And it's pretty incredible. I mean, this guy, Richard Werner, and I want you to go listen to the whole thing, but he talks about how banks per se are not bad, but what's happened every time we have one of these crises, you know, assets get reshuffled, banks become more centralized. The banking centralization is what leads to kind of this K-shaped economy where, you know, there's the haves and there's the have-nots. He talks about the Bundesbank, and he compares it to the Reichsbank, which is, these are both German banks, German central banks, but they were run very differently. And he talks about them, and he talks about just in general how centralization leads to a lack of prosperity, consolidation of power, and ultimately some level of tyranny. And I just thought it was a really interesting conversation. He's got a very deep knowledge of history and economics and banking. And essentially, one of the things he talks about in here is that it's always the banks. It's the banks and the CIA, or you know, whatever the information apparatus is, the propaganda arm, the intelligence arm that kind of gets together with the elites that control the banking system that leads to all these conflicts. It's always that way. And I thought that was very interesting. But I want to tie what's going on today a little bit to the run-up to World War I, because they're very similar conditions. And I thought this was an interesting thing to talk about, given where we are right now with this conflict with Iran, the fact that we can't seem to put an end to it. You know, we thought we could go in there and just decapitate the regime and move on, but that's not really what has happened. And then we've got this ally in the Middle East who is not interested in peace, okay? We keep trying to make provisions for peace, and they keep putting red lines or poison pills into that process that are things that are they're just a no-go for the enemy, in this case, Iran. For example, the idea of no nuclear program, none whatsoever. Not a civilian nuclear program, not a weapons nuclear program, no nuclear program, period, okay? And I'm not going to get into the hypocrisy around Israel, but Iran, again, is a signatory on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, okay? So they've already agreed not to have nuclear weapons. And Israel, who supposedly, if you look into it, has some 200 nuclear weapons, is not a signatory on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So who is the real threat in the region? Is it Iran with no nuclear weapons, no desire to get nuclear weapons, their signatures on the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or is it Israel? And my position is it's Israel. And so the problem that kind of creates for us right now is you got Trump, who desperately wants to strike a peace deal with Iran and put this thing to bed and get back to making money. That's what Trump's good at and known for, right? Let's all just get along and make money, right? And he thought he could throw his weight around and get some deal done, and that just hasn't happened. But then you got Israel over here who's looking like they're just not going to let us do a deal. I think Trump goes to him and says, "Hey, what do you think of this deal? What do you think of this deal?" And they're just like, no, that's not a good deal. No. And so their goal is to either get regime change or to just overthrow the government there and create like a chaotic situation where no real government power could really consolidate and be a threat at all. And so this is kind of the strategy, right? And so in World War I, you had a very similar kind of arrangement. So I'm going to let him talk about that in a minute. But first, we're going to go to this first clip and really talk about what's likely to happen, given where we are right now. And he's obviously, that's a little bit of speculation, but he's using history. He's using his knowledge about the banking system, about the desire to centralize banking. And one of the things he talks about in here, I'm just going to give you a preview of it. We've all heard about central bank digital currency. And he points out that banks have been using digital currency for decades now. This is not a new thing for banks. Your credit card, wire transfers, these are forms of digital banking. Online banking, these are all forms of digital banking. He said, so, the digital aspect of banking is not new. So the new thing in CBDC is not the digital. The new thing is the centralization. And if you go listen to this whole interview, you'll hear a theme that kind of runs through the whole interview, where the centralization of banking, centralization of power, centralization of whatever is always bad. And he talks about a principle called subsidiary, which is like a Catholic principle that says that you should delegate certain powers to the layers that those powers are needed. You don't consolidate all power at the top at a central authority. And so I just thought it was interesting that he was talking about centralization as being bad, and the fact that digital currency is not even a new thing. And so they're touting, like if you hear these central bankers make a case for why CBDC, what they're talking about is the digital aspects of it. But the digital aspects are not even new. That's not even what they're bringing to it. What they're bringing to it is the centralization of banking in a central bank, as opposed to JP Morgan, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, so on and so forth. Okay, we have a number of big banks, money center banks, Citibank, that where power is distributed because they control the money kind of in a distributed way, right? Jamie Dimon doesn't get to make all decisions for all banking everywhere. He only gets to make decisions for Chase Bank. And so this is what he means by distributed. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started on this interview. I thought it was really good. And I just think it's something to think about when you're looking at what's going on and where things are headed. All right, let's click in here.
Are somewhat overpriced, I dare say, in the US. But particularly when you look at stock markets, it doesn't necessarily mean there will be an immediate crash. But I do think we are heading towards a crisis. And again, if you look at the big game that's being played, then it's quite clear this has to happen. If the working hypothesis is that there are forces out there that want to dethrone America.
Yes.
And they may be active in America, even these forces.
No question about it.
And that means also dethroning the dollar. And that would explain why China actually had been strengthened with American investment in the past, because you're building up this opponent that can help take down America if you make sure America stays aggressive and adopts anti-China policies, which also seems to be happening to some extent. So then what are the scenarios here and what's the way? Well, as we said, whenever you have these big wars, they lead to currency system changes, the global financial system changes. So we moved from first the British pound, which was on and off the gold standard. Then we moved to the Bretton Woods dollar standard, which was a gold standard. But of course, a gold standard, some people think, that means it's 1-to-1 to gold and you can't create money. No, that never happened. Such a gold standard never existed. There's always been bank credit creation, and that's how the real game is played. But it's some kind of limit, because as soon as it turns out America was creating too many dollars, buying up assets in Europe, the French were not yet part of NATO, therefore not part of the command structure. It was the French that called out America.
We'd like our gold, please.
And they said, okay, you're printing all these dollars and you're buying us up. What we can do is we can change these dollars now into gold. We want to see gold. So that's, but so then we moved from the 71 Nixon shock, US default on its international gold obligations. Then we moved to the petrodollar, which of course is very closely intertwined to actions in the Middle East and all the wars in the Middle East. Oil was only allowed to be sold against the US dollar. Anyone who did otherwise, whether it's in Iraq, Saddam Hussein, or in Libya, Gaddafi, that was a big no-no and led to severe consequences, warfare. And
you get killed for that.
You get killed for it, exactly. So what's next? Because also when the last, when the Nixon shock happened and we moved from the gold dollar to the petrodollar, there was also inflation. Inflation is a good camouflage that, it sort of makes it easier to rearrange the monetary system. It was entirely monetary inflation, by the way, not energy driven. It was the central banks creating a lot of money. But we had the same in 2020 with the COVID psyop, money creation by central banks.
Now, did you catch that? That the oil shock in the 70s was not created by oil, was created by monetary action. So if you one of the things you notice, if you look at the price of oil in the 70s, when we had the quote unquote oil shock, it went from like $3 to like $30. Well, what is oil sold in worldwide? Dollars. See, so the dollar was being repriced in terms of oil, and this created this oil shock. Anyway, the other thing that I thought was interesting that he talks about there is that when you have these changes in the monetary system, when you're changing from one system to another, it's usually done during the inflation-deflation kind of combination of events. And what happens is if you have a bunch of debt, okay, and you can't service the debt, then what happens is those assets get taken from you legally, turns out, and the bank owns those assets. And so he talks about like a reshuffling of the financial system. And really what he's talking about is a reshuffling of who gets to own what. Just because you own a lot now, unless you own it outright and you can pay the taxes on it, the government can exercise like due process on you and take it from you. or the bank can take it from you if you can't make payments on it. If you have too much debt, they can seize your assets to pay off your debts. And so now the bank doesn't want assets, so they turn around and sell them to somebody else. But what this does, I mean, you can just envision a situation like we were talking about Warren Buffett a few weeks ago, I think. And Warren Buffett has some $380 billion in cash. Well, what do you think he's sitting there waiting on? He's waiting on something like this to happen. He's waiting for the banks to seize someone's property because they can't pay for it. And he's going to scoop it up. Or he's going to wait till stocks go down 80% and then he's going to buy them up. Okay? But the point is, he's got dry powder to buy assets at fire sale prices. And this allows this reshuffling of the financial system. And so he talks, there's other areas in this interview that he talks about it, and it's a little bit, he gives some other examples. But I just thought that was an interesting part of this first section here. All right, let's continue.
No economic rationale for this whatsoever. It was clear 18 months later we get inflation. As a result, that's what happened. So it looks like we're, and now we could be, it looks like we're heading into the second run of inflation. It's still early stages, not entirely clear, but that would be my guess without having yet the necessary data. But I think there will be a second bout of inflation. But we already had the first bout, and it indicates that we are in this phase of running up towards the next rearrangement of the monetary system. What is it going to be? That seems to be increasingly clear. It's going to be digital, based on digital identity. And I think we therefore should oppose digital ID on all fronts. We're humans. We're not digits. We have digits, 10 digits, okay? But, we should not subject ourselves to this regime where if you don't provide the right digital ID credentials, you're not accepted as a human and you don't have the human rights in reality. I mean, that's, dehumanizing. We should reject it just on that principle, but there's many other reasons why we should reject it. It is the beginning of this control regime of a digital currency. Now, digital currency as such is not a bad thing, because for half a century we've been using bank digital currency, BDC we could call it.
Yeah.
Because the banking system has been digital, and most money is created by banks. It's digital money. We have been using decentralized bank digital money, and actually has worked quite well. And the banks have never sold our personal transactions data to anyone. So actually we should laud the banks, because the new regime is all about our information about our transactions being sold freely.
The government is now Facebook.
And yes, exactly, being used to manipulate us, whether it's in elections or, to sell products and services that we don't really need. So it's going to be a digital currency. It is marketed as CBDC, central bank digital currency. I call it central bank digital control, because that's what it is. It's not really a currency. It's more control, as Catherine Austin Fitz always points out quite correctly. And so, because we've been using BDC, bank digital currency, what is the difference? It's the central. They tell us as justification, Christine Lagarde, that we need this because there's Bitcoin, we need digital central bank currency now as well. Well, the digital is not the new aspect. We have digital money. It's the central aspect that this is about. Because, and particularly if there's now another bout of inflation, and in some countries with the boom-bust cycles being arranged such that in Germany we're in a property bust now. There was the bubble arranged by the ECB from 2009 to 2022. Now property prices are steadily declining, putting banks slowly under more and more pressure. They were forced to do this by the ECB. It's the same game as the Bank of Japan's game, in Japan. And so banking crisis, of course, is ideal, and inflation to launch your CBDC. That's for Europe. In other countries, there may be slightly other rationales and justifications for introducing it. But a crisis, one way or another, is always good. A war, of course, is even better, because then it's just wartime direct diktats. You can't do anything. It's wartime. You have to accept whatever you're told. And as a wartime measure, of course, that's the ultimate. If everything else fails, then definitely wartime measures would be used to introduce these measures. So we're heading towards digital control systems where we have no more control over our liquid assets. It will be, of course, programmable, permission-based. So only what the central planners allow you to use your money for, at what time and place and location will be permitted. And if you're in the wrong place, it's not going to work. And if you're buying the wrong book title, it's not going to work, and so on. I mean, there's no limit to how much you can fine tune and control. Oh, but they don't have so much power. They can't control, millions of people. This is what the drive to build all these hundreds, in fact, thousands of data centers is about. It is an organizational challenge to micromanage the world's population through the new financial world order. Yes, but they're working on solving that. AI is really about that. If AI was about helping us to be more productive, the principle of decentralization would be applied, because any human organization and anything where humans are involved, if you introduce the principle of decentralization, subsidiarity, it will be more productive, no doubt, more efficient, more productive. That's been demonstrated in many contexts. I mentioned the warfare, military, but and businesses and so on. It's true for everything.
Yeah, we talk about that a lot here too, that central planning, central authority, it gives you the least amount of productivity. If you want the most amount of wealth for the most amount of people, then you decentralize everything. You deregulate everything. To the extent something needs to be regulated in Texas, then Texas should do it. Or if something needs to be regulated in Iowa, then Iowa should do the regulation. There shouldn't be this central EPA that tells the whole country how to manage the air quality in their region, right? I know it seems like that should be that way. But if you want a system that's productive and provides the highest standard of living for the most number of people, then you decentralize things. You don't centralize them. And I don't think anybody could argue that the process, certainly since FDR, but I could even go back further than that to the progressive era, like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, that the country has been centralizing, okay? Certainly after the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, the country has been on a path of centralization. And this is why over time, our standard of living is going down. This is why it takes minimum 2 incomes today to maintain a household, when just 30 years ago you could do it on 1 income, okay? There's nothing happening there. Capitalism is not causing that. What's causing that is the government largesse, the government's ability to print, create credit, and move the assets around. Have a boom and bust cycle and move the assets around, steal them from these people and give them to these people. It's not as simple as that, but that's the effect, okay? I'm talking about the effect of centralization, not the actual thing that's happening. If you lose your house in a bankruptcy, you don't sit there and go, what you say is the bank took my house because I couldn't make payments on it. But the bank itself set up conditions in such a way that you couldn't make payments on it. Weren't going to be able to make payments on it. They knew that at the beginning. They created the conditions where you can't make payments on it. And so that gives them the opportunity to take your house away from you and then sell them off to BlackRock or whoever, Vanguard. So this is the game, okay? This is the banker's game. This is how they do it. And the Federal Reserve is a big part of that. It's the centralized authority that allows the creation of money, the creation of credit. And the banks, are in a cartel. They're part of it. So they benefit as the central bank moves its policy around. They're certainly not doing their policy prescriptions for you and me. That's not what this is about. What it's about their friends. It's about control. It's about power. It's about all that stuff. It's not about prosperity. If it was about prosperity, we wouldn't have a central bank at all. And even if we had banks, we'd have thousands of banks and not just 3 or 4, okay? But the government likes it this way. They like to have 3 or 4 of something because it's easier to regulate 3 or 4 of something than it is 10,000 of something. And so the central government specifically likes that. And of course, they use the panic of, 1908 or something, 1908 or 1907 to scare everybody and tell everybody, well, this is why we did this, is because of this panic, and now it's better. Well, it's not better. I mean, there's a lot of evidence for why it's not better. But that's the official story, right? The official story is before the federal government created OSHA and the central bank and these kinds of things, we were killing each other in factories. We were toiling around in the dirt for subsistence living, and it was just horrible until, the federal government came, passed a bunch of laws and made us follow all these regulations and continuously increase the money supply on our behalf so that prices wouldn't go down. Well, who doesn't want prices to go down? Nobody said ever that they didn't want prices to go down. Or the triple-headed, it's the policy, it's the propaganda, it's the lawmaking authority. And at the end of the day, we're the victims of it all. All right, let's continue here with Dr. Werner.
But that's not what they're doing. They're creating highly centralized structures, which proves that it's not about actual productivity. It's about controlling us. That's why they need these huge resources. Then you can control inflation easily because people can't buy when the central banks don't allow you to buy.
Yes.
So then prices can't be driven up. And also you control movement of people. You can't buy a ticket. You can't go here and there because your money won't work outside a certain zone, whether it's 15-minute prison zone or whatever it may be. It is the totalitarian dictator's dream come true. And that is the scary thing. Most people are still not aware that we are so close to the scariest, most dystopian system where we're giving so much control and power into the hands of ever fewer people over our lives and billions of people. Again, if everyone is good, like the majority of people, and the controllers, the elites, the central planners are good, it's not an issue. But that's not what human history teaches us. And human nature, we know, is different. Most people actually, once they're given a lot of power, that comes with temptations of power. And most can't handle those temptations. And they give in. And then that's when power gets abused. That's why Lord Acton, a British political observer and advisor to prime ministers, concluded power corrupts. Most people get corrupted by power. They can't handle power. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. We're talking about absolute power in the hands of central planners if we allow the central bank digital currency to be imposed. And the central planners will have this absolute power, including, of course, they have already monetary power, but they will have the tools to deploy this in every detail to micromanage us. That is a new dimension of power, and effectively includes fiscal policy, because ultimately everything becomes controlled by the central bank. So now you could still say, well, we have some politicians, they meet for parliamentary votes and they decide budgets. Well, all that will become obsolete because everything will be controlled by the central bank. This is what the politicians don't realize, that the central bank digital currency is the first step by the central planners, the monetary central planners, to take over everything. So the dangers are just so manifold that it's quite clear that we have to stop this. This is really the big scenario. And that's where we see forces pushing as internationally power gets ever more centralized. Despite this being the biggest lesson of the 20th century, there's not a good idea to constantly have more power in the hands of fewer and fewer people. This is actually being accelerated in the 21st century.
I agree. The lesson of the 20th century really is that centralizing power ruined everybody's life. It caused wars. It killed a bunch of people. I mean, in the same way communism killed, I don't know, how many millions of people did communism kill? 60, 80 million, something like that? Maybe more, maybe 100 million. In the same way that communism killed a bunch of people, centralization of power, the centralizing of power in America killed people also in wars and stuff, but it also ruined people's prosperity. It ruined the very idea of freedom. Okay? Because if you don't have economic freedom, then you don't have freedom. Simple as that. I was talking to my father-in-law today, and I mean, this just goes to show you what a different time we're living in, okay? He retired in 1987. Think about that. 40, I don't even know what that is. What is that? 40, 48, 49 years ago. Something like that. He only worked 30 years. Think about that. He worked 30 and has been retired for 40 years. Let's just say it like, that's amazing. Okay? That is not going to be something that you and I are going to be able to do. Okay? He got enough wealth accumulation before the inflation really kicked in, is what happened. I mean, he was working in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s. And to the extent where there was inflation, he was able to make 16, 17, 18% by holding cash. You and I are never going to have that opportunity. And so and he's not a rich man or anything like that. He just saved like normal people save, and he did invest well so that he didn't lose his money. He watched it very carefully. But that is not going to be available to most people going forward. The inflation, the undermining of the standard of living, the regulation to the point where opportunity is limited. These trends are these are going in the wrong direction, okay, for something like a 40-year retirement to happen. So I don't think enough people really, a lot of people are not, they don't tie the history and the economics together. Sure, people know that, Nixon closed the gold window in August of 1971. Of course they know that. But they don't know the economics associated with that and the history that kind of goes along with it. And this is hurting us. I don't think there's any question about it. And of course, the thing about it is, when you have a system like we have, the inflation has to accelerate. It can't just be linear. They have to inflate more and more and more. It has to be exponential. And of course, the results are going to be exponential too. We're going to feel it more and more inside of a single generation. Used to be you could look at your parents and say, well, I have more than my parents did or whatever. And their parents had more than their parents did. In other words, people looked at this kind of change over generations. But now this kind of change is happening within a single generation. So now the very people that are alive right now are experiencing this rapid loss of standard of living. So this is going to change everything, essentially. And the risk really is that people clamor for more government because they think government has got some magic wand that they can wave and everybody gets what they want and nobody has to pay for it. And of course that makes things worse. All right, the next clip that I want to play has to do with the run-up to World War I. And I think this is important. What you're going to hear, like what I learned in school, let's talk about that. What I learned in school is that World War I was kicked off by the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand of Prussia. Okay? And that kicked off the First World War. Okay. Well, what does that mean? I mean, does that mean that like somebody gets assassinated today, World War III is going to happen? I mean, do assassinations cause wars? Look, I was naive, just like most of us, and I thought, yeah, must have been an important guy or whatever, and so, World War I kicked off because of this assassination. Well, you're going to hear a slightly more. In fact, he doesn't even mention that. He doesn't even mention that as a cause of World War I. And I just thought it was really interesting to let him tell you the causes that were happening economically, okay? The same kind of story could be told about the American Civil War. I'm not going to go into it right now. We've talked about it before, but it's the same story. If you go to school today, the Civil War was all about slavery. No, not really. There was more going on there, a lot more going on. Just like the run-up to World War I didn't start with the assassination of Archduke, Ferdinand of Prussia. Okay, same kind of thing. There were economic things happening. There was a global power, England, and they were being threatened by this up-and-coming rival, Prussia. And, all these things were happening. And so I just thought I would play it, let you guys hear it. I'll jump in maybe a couple of times, but I just thought this was brilliant. I'd never even heard it before. And I believe me, if somebody should have heard this, it should have been me, because I've been digging into things like this forever, trying to get a better understanding of what really happened. All right, here we go. All right, let's jump into this clip.
Venezuela and Iran is connected in that both of those conflicts are aimed at China.
Indeed. Yeah, that's exactly it. And that's where now I think it's good to go back again to the run-up to the First World War. What was the situation? It was a situation where we had one global hegemon, Britain, running the world. Half the world was formerly part of the British Empire. Of course, not acquired through free and open elections, was it?
No.
So military force, at times extremely brutal, colonial suppression. For quite a long time, the greater part in the subcontinent in India, run by a for-profit enterprise, the East India Company. So you had colonialism run by a for-profit enterprise. It's not a good idea. It's not very nice for people. The estimates vary of how many million Indians were killed under this rule by a for-profit company, being in charge of millions and millions of people. And actually, the ruling elite in the East India Company always had this view: well, it's too many Indians. We don't really need that many Indians. Horrible views out there. Too many useless eaters. This is where, by the way, this whole overpopulation agenda that I'd like to talk to you about came from. It goes back to the East India Company, because Malthus, who is this famous economist talking about overpopulation,
yes,
he literally worked for the East India Company. And it's known, and there's many quotes of the East India Company people saying there's too many people, we don't need all these Indians. But anyway, we'll come back to it. So that's the picture of the world. So Britain, half the world directly under British control in a colonial regime that clearly benefited Britain, not the colonial subjects to the same extent. Many suffered and many died. That includes actually, of course, one of the first colonies of Britain was Ireland. And, there's the great Irish famine, the potato famine. Well, did you know that during the potato famine, Ireland produced potatoes and exported potatoes to England while Irish people were starving? So it wasn't a lack of potatoes. It was policies that resulted in this famine. But anyway, there are too many Irish people. We have documents of British leaders saying that. It's all these Irish people. We don't need so many Irish people. So this is the background, okay? So Britain in charge of the world. Now, we had this development earlier on of a new economic power and political power in Europe, Prussia. Prussia was the first modern high-growth economy, and it was quite breathtaking. It was high growth and prosperity for the majority of the people. It was capitalism, but it was capitalism of a kind where the idea was, well, we want it to be sustainable capitalism in the sense that we don't want to have mass poverty at the same time. We don't want this K-shaped economy where the elite is doing really well, but the majority of the people are not doing well. And I think it's perfectly rational to say that that's not really a great system, because you're storing up trouble for the future, right?
Yes.
If the majority is actually not benefiting, and it is and you have increasingly democratic structures, then at some stage something will change, right?
Yes.
So you want to avoid it, and they did it very early on. So the first modern sort of social security legislation was done in Prussia. Also, of course, the first investment in public schools, properly public schools and kindergartens and universities, was in Prussia. It was a very modern state, highly successful. The middle class was thriving. It was merit-based. You could move up the ladder. If you put in your energy and your efforts, it will be rewarded. very successful economy, based, of course, also on the system of decentralization, local decision-making, and especially many small local banks lending to small firms. Now, Prussia then morphed into Germany in 1871.
Yes. The unification.
Which is another, or partial unification, because, of course, many German states were left out, such as Austria, under international influence, but also Prussia felt Austria was a rival, and so on. I mean, that's for another show. There's a lot of interesting stuff happening there. But the principles were also applied in now Imperial Germany under essentially Prussian leadership. And again, Imperial Germany was highly successful. Economic growth just in the beginning of the 20th century was very high. It was a high growth economy again, and people benefited, prosperity, the middle class. It was quite impressive. The cities, beautiful, massive public investment, railway network, schools, universities, science. This is the beginning of science being German dominated. In the first half of the 20th century, the majority of scientific publications were in German, and all the leading research was in these publications. That was where things were happening, and other countries were looking at this model. Now, the place that didn't like that was the hegemon of the world, Britain. That clearly was, from their viewpoint, rivalry.
Okay, let's stop there for a second. Yeah, I think I misspoke earlier. I think I said Prussian, the Archbishop or Archduke Ferdinand of Prussia. I think that was Austria, actually. You can see that if you look at Great Britain in the 1860s, 1870s, coming off the Industrial Revolution, and they've just extended their power all over the world, from Australia to New Zealand to India to wherever, Africa. He mentions the East India Company. This reminds me of the story that I told you about how the Dulles brothers overthrew Arbenz in Guatemala because the Dole Company didn't like something that was going on down there. Same kind of thing. A Dole Company is getting the U.S. government to go beat up on Guatemala because Dole needs to harvest bananas in Guatemala. It's like, what? I mean, Guatemala belongs to the Guatemalans, right? Not the Dole brothers or not the Dole Company or the Dulles brothers. The same kind of deal. You've got the East India Company basically pilfering resources out of India and getting India to do all the work. The Indians killed a bunch of Indians in the process, and then complained that there was just too many Indians. I mean, this is just arrogance on a level that's just unimaginable almost. But you can start to see that Great Britain, in a way, they were kind of, this colonialism. What is colonialism, right? I mean, colonialism is essentially a great power taking advantage of some lesser power, probably paying the people at the top, right? They're giving the people at the top, the people with the political power, the money, and letting them abuse their people. That's essentially what colonialism is. And, Great Britain was going around and going to all these countries, South Africa and India, Australia, all these places, to get resources, right? This industrial revolution that was happening was required a lot of resources to build stuff. I mean, Great Britain doesn't have a lot of resources of its own, and so they use this colonial model, and we're doing the same thing. It's not really thought of this way, but the whole idea that we have the dollar hegemony, okay, which allows us to buy resources. If I go buy, I don't know, let's say I buy something worth $100 billion from France, and I just print up the money and give it to France, and they give me whatever it is. They give me this thing for $100 billion, but what I did is I paid basically little pieces of paper. That's a different way of stealing. Okay, instead of running a colonial system and stealing, we can actually just kind of print up money or, write down little IOUs and send them to people and buy things of real value. Like, hey, I want to buy this entire oil field over here and I'll pay you $800 billion for it. Okay, the $800 billion that I create to pay for it. Now, it's different if Chevron buys it or something like that, or ExxonMobil buys it, because ExxonMobil earned the money. But that's not what you had going on with the East India Company. The East India Company was a private-public partnership, essentially. And so just like, we have the same thing with like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. These companies operate on a private basis until they get into trouble, and the government prints up money and bails them out or keeps them in business. It's the same kind of thing. It's a type of theft. Anyway, it's just interesting that this is what Great Britain was doing from let's call it 1850 up to 1880, and then you got Prussia and Imperial Germany coming along and rising to the top, but in a very distributed way, not so much a top-down kind of structure or a centralized structure, but you got everybody's kind of winning in Germany, from the lowly guy that makes shoes and boots all the way up to the guy that owns all the businesses or whatever. The wealth is being earned in a distributed way across the country. That doesn't mean the government's taking the money and redistributing it. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's prosperity at the low end, the middle, and the high end in Imperial Germany. And so you can just imagine how proud that makes people. So there's like a spirit of nationalism in there too. All right, let's continue here.
Being built up and growing. And it is one thing to start to lose market share, because Britain used to be the number one economic power, industrial revolution, and mass production really happened first in Britain and then spread from there to other countries. So Britain was, in the sequence chronology of economic development, was number one. But then soon after, Germany came, and of course also at the same time America also rose as a emerging economy, high growth economy as well. Let's not forget that. But of course, America is further away and was, for international documents, using English. So I suppose the British felt less immediately threatened by America. Germany is very close. And the decision was made, we've got to do something about this. But a key turning point in this, in really resolving the British goals, and creating this conviction that war has to be made on Germany, was the following development. So British power was projected across the globe through the seas, the oceans, the navy, because it was a global empire, from Britain to Australia and many parts of the world. Shipping was, of course, very important, and control of the seas was important, and it was in British hands. So no doubt about that. Nobody could even come close to the numbers of ships and British naval dominance. But then something else happened that was felt as a huge threat. Germany developed this plan in working on the continent. It's a continental power, and we have this conflict between the sort of sea power and the continental power now. Germany made plans to, it's quite natural, to improve its access to resources. Germany didn't really have many resources. It has coal for the steel industry. It had some input, but it still needed other raw materials and inputs from across the globe. So how do you get that? If it's via the seas, then essentially it's beholden to the British, can be blackmailed by the British, as actually happened, demonstrated in 1919. The First World War in Germany was over in 1918, when the armistice was signed. And German leaders have always been slightly on the naive side, believing, okay, that's an armistice, that's that. The First World War is ended. Germany wasn't defeated. No foreign troops on German territory.
Yet.
And it disbanded its army and its navy, right? But the British, of course, didn't disband their army and navy. And they then staged a naval blockade of Germany. Suddenly shipping was entirely cut off. As a result, it's estimated around 1 million Germans starved to death in the famine of 1919, which was engineered by the British, just to illustrate the reality when you're beholden to a sea power that controls the seas for your inputs. And so on the one hand, Germany had been aware of that risk, and it was working on alternatives. And on the other hand, Britain had adopted countermeasures. What were the countermeasures? So around
1 million Germans starved to death
in 1919. And of course, Britain continued to fight on British cenotaphs of the First World War. Often in the countryside, you see the First World War defined as 1914 to 1919. Because, dead bodies were still arriving in the villages. You couldn't tell the pastor, no, write 1918 on the cenotaph. Well, we still had our fallen coming, and then the villagers recording the deaths in 1919. So now what really changed things was around 1900, the German plan to improve its raw material resource access to avoid these issues that unfortunately could not be in the end avoided, but not to be beholden. It was trying not to be in a situation where it's blackmailed by Britain through the seas, namely to have a continental transport system. And this plan was developed by, on the investment side and the engineering side, Siemens, major German engineering company, and funded by Deutsche Bank, namely the plan to build the Berlin-Baghdad-Basra railway via Istanbul. Ottoman Empire was already an ally, and so it's quite natural to gain access to the Gulf area and oil, which was beginning to be, clearly an important resource. And so they started building that railway, the Berlin-Baghdad-Basra railway. That's when the British colonial and empire planners decided this really has to be stopped. Because had that been built in time and completed, then it would have rendered essentially the British naval dominance irrelevant, because you can transport energy, resources, raw materials, you can sell your high value added output to actually the British Empire, Middle East or India, to the rest of the world. You can ship through your own railway network without British interference. So the British planners decided this cannot be allowed. This has to be stopped by all means, including war. And it was a key factor in the run-up to the First World War. Of course, there were other factors. The German.
All right. Yeah, there were other factors, right? We're not going to get into it here, but the interesting thing, to me, this is what I hear about this is kind of the emperor has no clothes kind of moment. So if you look at America today, what is it about the Middle East? What are we doing there that has us able to get our way in the Middle East? Okay. Well, it's the way we project power, right? So we have bases in Saudi Arabia, we have bases in Qatar and Kuwait, in all these places, and there's actually military stationed in these places, right? And so that you're looking at that, if you're a rival power and you're looking at that and going, man, I don't know if I want to take on the U.S. military, right? But Trump starts this war. Okay, so I'm just drawing an analogy here, an emperor has no clothes kind of analogy. And, Trump starts this war, and the Iranians have nothing to do but fight back. And what do? They target our bases in these places. And of course, we're not doing anything from them. We can't defend Saudi Arabia and Qatar and all these, Kuwait and these places from those bases. They're just outposts, basically, okay? So this projection of power is kind of one of these emperor has no clothes moments, okay? So all of a sudden, Iran sees this, and this is one of the reasons they're insisting that we leave the Middle East. This is part of their conditions. Maybe I can bring up their conditions here in just a second, but one of the conditions that they're making known, let's just pull them up. Here we go, Iranian conditions. Hide this. Okay, I'm going to have to put my glasses on for this. So let's look at these. Immediate and permanent cessation of war, okay. Sovereignty over the Strait of Hormuz. They may get that, they may keep that, they may not, we'll see. Secure transit protocol, okay. U.S. military withdrawal, the complete exit of the United States forces from all bases deployment points across the Middle East. This is what I'm talking about. We were using these bases to project our power, to project hegemony over the region. And one of the things that we did when we started this war, and we started it, okay, we started it with Israel's encouragement. We thought we were going to, decapitate the regime and move on, no problem. But what that did is it forced Iran to engage us militarily, okay? And then what they saw is that, this projection of power in the Middle East is really that. It's just a projection of power. It's not a real threat to us. Let's just add that to our list of conditions. You have to leave the Middle East, right? And so this is going to be perceived, this is what I was talking about, this is going to be perceived as a big loss for America, because this is the thing that supposedly ensures the petrodollar. Okay? Why? What are we giving for the petrodollar? Well, the petrodollar is us making a deal with Saudi Arabia primarily, but the Gulf states that are part of the cartel there, that, hey, if you sell oil in US dollars, we'll protect the Middle East. We'll protect you in the Middle East. But what did we just find out? We can't protect them. We can't do it. Not, at least not from these positions. And you really can't do it from the air, okay? You have to have boots on the ground. And so these forward military areas were supposed to be the boots on the ground that ensured Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, UAE. It ensured the safety and security of these regions, and that's why they were selling oil in dollars. But maybe that breaks down going forward, especially if we have to leave the Middle East. So see, this is no matter how you kind of slice and dice this, it's going to end up as a loss for America. Now, I'm okay with it, because I really feel like if you want something that another country has, you just buy it. Okay, that's what you do. You don't take it. You don't insist that they sell it in your currency. You just buy it, and if you're producing and they're producing, then a trade happens, right? Because both people's currencies are worth money on the open market. This is why I say we just go to gold and let money flow back into the United States and just retreat into our continental fortress, as Professor Zhang always says. But lifting of sanctions, I mean, can you imagine what the war hawks are going to say about that? We had to give up all the sanctions. We can't sanction Iran anymore because now we have a treaty with them. Lifting of secondary sanctions. We can't go to our partners in Europe and insist that they can't buy or sell to Iran. Release of frozen assets. So let's say we have T-bills, or we've got bonds that belong to Iran that are held at the New York Fed. We have to release that, okay? We have to give them back their money. Nuclear program recognition. We accept Iran's right to uranium enrichment for the peaceful purposes and the termination of all IAEA and UN Security Council resolutions. Okay, so they want a peaceful nuclear program. And then binding resolutions, they want all that to stop at the UN as well. So there's just a lot of parallels to what's going on right now to what was happening in the run-up to World War I. And what I would say is go listen to this whole interview with Tucker Carlson gives with Richard Werner. It is very, very interesting. The part I found especially interesting was just the recognition that it's always the banks, the elites, and the intelligence communities. That trio, those are always the people that are dragging everybody else through broken glass so that they can retain their power, they can retain their wealth. and it's all done at our expense. And a lot of it is done because of the money system. And I know I say this all the time, but it's just more evidence that if you fix the money, a lot of these problems get fixed. People mind their own business. You don't have people doing sanctions and stuff. Look, if you got the gold, then you trade with somebody. I mean, to do sanctions, you would have to go park your aircraft carriers off their ports and things like that. And that's an act of war. And usually will turn into something kinetic. So just the idea that you can just do sanctions on somebody by removing them from the monetary system, this is all stupid stuff, and it doesn't work, as Russia has demonstrated. And of course, Iran is going to demonstrate this as well. And how many times do we have to do this before we learn? Doing sanctions on Cuba is not the same thing as doing sanctions on Russia. Russia has oil. They have resources they can sell. And they can just strike up deals with people to sell those resources in rubles. Or is that their currency, rubles? I can't remember. Russian rubles, yeah. Or in yuan or whatever. They don't have to do business in the US dollar. They can do business in gold. They can do business in some other currency. So these things don't work anyway. And we just need to, I think, quit being the global hegemon and just say, hey, we're no longer going to be the world's policeman. Sorry, we just can't afford to do it anymore. And we're pulling out. And just retreat into North America, manage our hemisphere of the world, trade with anybody that wants to trade with us in the East or in the European West, or Russia or whoever. Just trade with people and get along with people, and I think we'd all be better off. But that's me saying it. Logically, you can kind of come to that place. I have no evidence for sure that's where we would end up. Someone like John Bolton would say, no, there's no way that'll work. We'll get beat up. China will take advantage of us, or whoever. Look, the only reason we have the power we have is because we can print up dollars. And we force, at the point of a gun, the rest of the world to accept those dollars. That's insane. That just cannot continue. All right, well, I've been talking for a while, a little over an hour. Thank you guys for coming in and listening. Hope you enjoyed that. Hope you go listen to the whole interview. It's very fascinating. It's probably one of the most important interviews I've heard in a long time. Just on a side note, Thomas Massey lost his race. I think Trump is a complete imbecile, and Miriam Adelson is the devil. And man, we've got to put an end to this privilege system. This system where you can lobby Congress to provide the U.S. government military action on your behalf, or the congressional lawmaking authority on your behalf. We just got we got to put an end to that. And of course, my amendment is the best way to do that. Look at that real quick. There's the amendment. It's called the Integrity of Representation and Sovereignty Act. Essentially, it takes away the ability of the executive or congressional or executive action privilege to any government, any individual, any corporation. Essentially, just takes away their ability to lavish privilege on somebody with the force of the United States government. I think that's the best way to do it. I think we get back to single item bills, and these bills have to be for the purposes of improving or increasing liberty or securing property. That's it, period. And any state can raise its hand and say, I think that's unconstitutional, and start the proceeding of just ignoring any law that comes out of Congress that doesn't do one of those two things, either protect liberty or to secure property. All right, with that, I'm going to go and wrap up. Thanks for coming in, guys, and listening. I don't know. I haven't been doing too many shows. Part of it is I'm just, I don't know, just nothing really that is really getting my juices flowing that I've seen. Like I said, the whole war thing, we have a deal, we don't have a deal, we had a deal, but those guys backed out. We have a new deal, but they didn't sign it. It's just ridiculous. Let's get on with signing a deal. It's not going to be a good deal for us, and I think we just need to accept it and move on. It's either that, or you're going to put 1 million boots on the ground, or be willing to drop, a dozen nuclear weapons on Iran. And I don't think either one of those are good for America. Think about the latter. The United States would be, if that happened, we would be the only country in the entire world that's ever used nuclear weapons and did it twice. That's not a good look. And I think all the guns would be aimed at America if that happened. All right, with that, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks for coming in, y'all. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe the show on YouTube and come back and listen. All right, everybody. Peace. Talk to you soon. Bye.